Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending when you listen to this, and welcome to Tax in the Spotlight, the Safri Sports and Entertainment podcast. I'm Pete Hackleton, partner and head of the sports and entertainment team at Safri's, and today I'm joined by Alex Hills, the director in the team, and in this episode, we're going to be discussing the world of tennis. We act for many of the top 100 female and male tennis stars, and in a sport that's made up of busy schedule played across the globe, complex tax issues naturally arise, and that's where we help our clients. Alex, thank you for joining me today. Good to see you.
Pete, good to see you.
And maybe let's start off by just talking about the general landscape for tennis players. As I said in the intro, their lives are quite similar to those in motorsport, which we covered in our last episode, mainly due to the fact these people are essentially not permanent in any one location across the year.
Yeah, exactly right, Pete. So as touring athletes, tennis players operate pretty much a nomadic lifestyle, spending very little time at home during the year. So to give a bit of an idea of the travel, so starting from the beginning to the end of the year, we kick off with the Grand Slams, so Grand Slam in Australia, and then on to the Middle East. From there, you go over to the US, where there's a couple of big 1000 series tournaments, being Indian Wells and Miami. After that, everything comes back over to Europe, where we've got a build up towards Roland Garros in Paris, and preceding that, we will have had Madrid and Rome, where I've just come back from. And then it's kind of back over to the grass court season. So there's a couple of tournaments in the build up to Wimbledon. So we've got Queens and we've got Halle being the main ones. And then from my point of view, one of the biggest tournaments of the year, Wimbledon in the peak of summer. And then finally back over, well, I say finally, we go on over towards Canada and the States in the build up to the US Open. And then off to the Far East as we reach autumn. And then finally, at the end of the season, there's the World Tour Finals, which are over in Italy. And we've got Davis Cup, just to throw that into the mix too. So with all of that, it's quite clear that there's an awful lot of countries involved. And many of those have, first of all, withholding taxes, which get knocked off the prize money. And in addition to that, there's the added complication with a few of these countries requiring tax returns. So we've got the likes of the US, Canada, Australia, UK, and France all requiring tax returns. And what that means is, so you have an initial withholding tax deducted, you then look at your total income and expenditure, and you're then required to file a return where you may either have some additional tax to pay, or in some cases you might get a small refund. But what's clear is that there's an awful lot of tax compliance to deal with as a touring athlete. The other thing that's quite a common misconception, so when you take into account all of these withholding taxes and tax filings, even if you're living in what might be perceived to be a low tax jurisdiction, such as Monaco or the UAE, typically a tennis player might have a global tax rate in the region of 25 to 30%. By virtue of all these foreign taxes. The other thing that's kind of become even more interesting with Monaco and the UAE is there's ever increasing tax compliance in those countries too. So there's things like VAT registrations. There's now actually in the UAE a new corporate tax legislation that's been introduced, which at the moment it's a little bit unclear as to how that applies exactly to the likes of tennis players and golfers. But that's something we're working with advisors in the UAE to kind of get to grips with, so we can advise our clients accordingly. So with all that, it's just to say that there's plenty of tax compliance to deal with as a tennis player. So it's important that you seek the right advisor.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you touched on there, in relation to the UAE, in my experience, not only do we have to cope with all of the different rules, but it's the constant changes as well. So, you gave the example at the start of the different countries that players will compete in around the year, basically 11 months of the year. And in any one of those countries, there can be changes which apply. So you mentioned the VAT and the business profits tax in UAE. I mean, that's just one example. And that really does kind of sum up the issues that we face with these guys. So, yeah, thank you for the overview. Really helpful. Maybe we could just go into a bit more detail about how the players would navigate those tax regimes in the different countries.
Yeah, so if we start off with an example or two. So I'll use the example of the US, UK, and France. So in those countries, if we're talking about the taxable income, so we've got the likes of prize money, appearance fee income. So appearance fees might be for if a player is playing in a lower grade tournament, so not one of the 1000 series tournaments, not one of the Grand Slams, but where the tournament wants to encourage the top players to attend. So there'll be appearance fees which are taxed in the respective countries, and there'll also be sponsorship income. And it's really the sponsorship income element which is the most complex of all of that. Of course, you do get expense deductions for any expenses you incur while attending those countries, but it's probably helpful if I just talk a little bit around the sponsorship income, because I think that's probably what most players would find interesting to understand a little bit better, and where there's potential areas for tax planning. So typically what you'd get with sponsorship agreements is there will be bonuses, and there'll be bonuses for tournament wins or doing well in tournaments. So it might be a semi-final of a Grand Slam. It might be the final of a 500 series event. So there would be those bonuses which would be 100% taxable in the jurisdiction in which those are earned. So if you're winning a Wimbledon bonus, that's going to be 100% taxable in the UK. You've then got the likes of ranking bonuses. So those will typically be paid if you've achieved a ranking which the sponsor figures are worthwhile paying to the player, by virtue of the fact they're probably going to be appearing on TV a lot more, giving the brand a lot more exposure. So those types of bonuses would be allocated generally according to ranking points. So again, to take the example of the UK, if you've gone and won 2,000 points from winning Wimbledon, and you've won 6,000 points in the year, then there would be an allocation fraction of 2,000 over 6,000 applied to the total ranking bonus that you've earned. And then the most complex of them in terms of allocation are retainers. So retainers are essentially the fixed amount that you would receive in the year from a sponsor. Now, it may be that those go up and down, and usually what happens, they might go, if you've moved from, say, being ranked 10 and you've then become ranked number 1, typically the following year your retainer might go up. But the way those get allocated varies a little bit from country to country. But perhaps the most interesting of those in terms of where there can be tax planning is the US. So in the US, you can either allocate 100% of that retainer on the basis of being a service-based payment. And in that scenario, you would simply look at how many tournaments has the player played in the US and how many tournaments have they played worldwide. And that would form the basis of the allocation fraction. So to give a very simple example, if you've got 5 tournaments in the States and you've got 20 tournaments worldwide, then you'd be allocating 25% of that retainer to the US, and it would be taxed thereon. Now, if you're a well-known tennis player, there can be an argument that actually part of that retainer is being paid for image use. And there's been a number of tax cases in the past which we can use as the basis for the filing. And generally, a fairly standard approach would be to take that retainer and divide it into, so the service-related element would be allocated based on the number of tournaments played, and the image-related element would be deemed to be a royalty payment, and that would be allocated based on the sales of the underlying product from the sponsor. So in some cases that can be advantageous. So for example, if that sponsor isn't selling much product in the States, in some cases it may not be. So if you've got the likes of a Nike sells an awful lot of product in the States, so it may not be to the player's advantage. But those are the types of things we can look into, and we do look into when we're dealing with a player's US filings. There's also scope for other tax planning would be things like contract structuring. So when we're looking at contracts, we typically look through all of the services within the contract, and there might be certain elements which we can carve out and apply a value to. And by doing that carve out, that would reduce the amount of income which would need to be applied to a foreign tax return. So an example might be if you've got a photo shoot which the sponsor considers to be particularly valuable to them, and if you've got a player who lives in a low tax jurisdiction, the player might be able to request that that photo shoot on an annual basis is carried out in their home country, in this low tax jurisdiction. And by taking out that value, that leaves a much lower amount available for allocation to the rest of the foreign tax jurisdictions. But generally, contract structuring, it's always a balance between what's achievable from a commercial perspective and what works from a tax point of view. But that's a bit of an overview of how it kind of works on the non-resident tax filing compliance side.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And it occurred to me as you were talking there, there's a theme there that we've touched on one of the previous pods, which is, if I talk to people at a dinner party about tax, which I try not to do as much as possible, but there seems to be a general opinion, which I totally understand, that when you're filing a tax return, there's only one way to do it. This is the position, this is what someone's earned, and this is what's due. But actually, there's a huge amount of subjectivity here, particularly around, as you said, what element relates to image, what relates to performance, and therefore, that is where I would say, we show our skills and ability in helping the clients to achieve the best possible position. Equally, also, as I get older and a bit more skeptical, I used to think that HMRC liked the certainty as well, but I think the subjectivity is helpful from an HMRC perspective as well. It helps them to, raise inquiries and think carefully about the position. So having mentioned HMRC, maybe we can talk a bit more about the UK tax laws. Obviously, we got Wimbledon, Queen's, Eastbourne coming up soon. Could you run us through the UK position?
Sure. So in the UK, first of all, it's worth mentioning that players often have a complaint that the UK they perceive to be either the highest or certainly one of the highest tax-paying jurisdictions, which to an extent is true. But I think where that perception comes from is in the UK, it's got a low withholding tax rate at 20%, but the maximum rate of tax goes up to 45%. So typically what happens if you've got a player performing well is the lion's share of the tax will be paid when the tax return is filed. And so if you contrast that with the US, where the withholding tax rate is much higher at 30%, when you're filing US returns, it can be quite a common occurrence where you're actually due a bit of a refund. So I think by virtue of the mismatch in when you pay the tax, either upfront by deduction of the withholding tax or when you file the return, I think it often feels much more painful when you're filing the UK return and have the significant amount of tax payable on the filing of the return. But yeah, in the UK, so as I alluded to earlier, it's quite similar to the US and France. So you have to include not only prize money income, appearance fee income, exhibition match income, but you've also got to allocate your sponsorship contracts. And again, it works in a fairly similar way to, as I described earlier, certainly when it comes to the tournament bonuses and the ranking bonuses. Again, a tournament bonus for a UK tournament, 100% taxable in the UK, ranking bonus based on ranking points. And when it comes to the retainer element of those contracts, the UK authorities look at what they call relevant performance days or relevant performance and training days. And what that means is, so a relevant performance day would either be a day where you're playing a tennis match in front of the public, or it could be any other professional tennis playing service that's performed in front of the public while you're in the UK. And what that means is tennis players need to be a little bit wary of the total number of these relevant performance days that they're doing. Just to illustrate, if they're playing in an exhibition match, that day is counted just as much as if they're playing a match at Wimbledon. So it's just something to be wary of. The important thing from a UK tax perspective is, again, it's to speak to your advisor. Is there anything you can do differently to help reduce the allocation fraction? For example, I mentioned there's relevant performance days as a basis, or there's relevant performance and training days. So if you can produce a calendar, a day-to-day calendar that includes not only your your relevant performance days, but also your training days, it might be that you end up with a slightly more advantageous fraction when it comes to allocation of those retainers. It's not a given, but it's something worth considering. So if you keep that calendar, then a comparison can be made of the two allocation methods.
Absolutely. And you made one of my favorite points there, which is around asking questions, but asking those questions in advance. Quite often in the past we've had, we've done this, what's the position, could we change it? Well, not if you've already done this, but if you're asking in advance about those events in the UK. And I particularly remember, obviously I've done nowhere near as much tennis work as you, but there was a tennis player who was over in London for the 2012 Olympics. And you might remember there was an exemption for games related income for the Olympic Games in London in 2012, but they were going to do a commercial appearance, a Nike Town appearance, and they had assumed that was going to be covered by the Olympic exemption, but of course it wasn't. That's not games related income, that's sponsorship income, and so we advise on that basis. I think just one last one, before we finish off. So how does Safri's generally support clients through these complex tax situations?
So I think our biggest point of differentiation, it comes to the fact we not only help with UK tax filings, but we can also help with the tax filings in the rest of the jurisdictions where returns are required. There's also the point that whereas at the moment we know all the jurisdictions which require returns, it's an ever moving environment. It could be next year there's a couple of other jurisdictions added to the list, but it's something which we keep a track of, and we like to think that because we very much live day to day in this environment, we're aware of exactly what the latest tax cases are, where the risks are, and we like to be able to bring everything together under one umbrella so that certainly for the tennis player's point of view, it's as straightforward as it can be. I'm not saying it's that straightforward, but it's as straightforward as you can be, and certainly much better, I would argue, than dealing with multiple tax advisors for all your non-resident tax filing jurisdictions. Obviously, we've got an awful lot of experience in this. I myself have been working in the space for 17 years now. So clearly getting a lot older, the time has raced on by. You've got an awful lot of experience in this area too. And of course, we've got a much wider team at Safri when things get complex. So I hope that kind of gives players reassurance that if they're looking for a tax advisor, certainly we're one of the best options out there.
One of the few advantages about getting older, it shows your experience, I think. Just let me just do what I did on the motorsport podcast, which I really enjoyed, which was put James on the spot at the end. Purely personal opinion. I put James on the spot and asked who was going to win the F1 World Championship this year. So purely unprepared. Alex, Wimbledon 2025. Who's your tip? Men's and women's.
I think on the men's front, I think I'll go with Yannick. I think he's been playing incredibly well. And although he just lost in Rome, I do think that after a period of time out, it was a pretty impressive display.
Yeah.
So I'll go with him. And I think because of his height and serve, I think maybe he's got the edge. But we'll see. I mean, Carlos is equally incredible.
And let's not forget Novak with his 7 previous Wimbledon titles.
In the women's, a difficult one. I actually had the pleasure of watching Paolini, I think it was last year, an incredible pocket rocket, and she's just going from strength to strength. So it'll be interesting to see how she does. I mean, a slight height disadvantage for grass, but I think maybe Coco Gauff playing incredibly well at the moment. Yeah, let's go with Coco with the height advantage.
Okay, you heard it here first. Thank you for that, Alex. Much appreciated, and really good conversation about the lives and tax challenges that the tennis players face. As ever, I always note this is a complex area and you should always take professional advice, and ideally from us. That's all for this episode of Tax in the Spotlight. Don't forget to subscribe, rate and review our show. And as ever, if you have any questions on today's topic or to find out more about us, please head to www.safri.com and drop us a line. Thank you all for listening.